The plane hummed with quiet chatter as passengers settled into their seats. A young black girl clutched her boarding pass, excitement bubbling in her chest. First class. She had never flown in first class before. She slid into her plush seat, running her fingers over the armrest when a shadow loomed over her. A flight attendant. Staring, not smiling. "Miss, I think you're in the wrong seat." The girl's heart skipped. She glanced at her ticket. First class, seat 3A. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. But the woman's icy stare said otherwise. She had barely taken her seat when it started. The flight attendant, a middle-aged white woman with a stiff smile and narrowed eyes, stopped beside her row. She didn't ask to see a ticket. She didn't ask if she needed help. She just stared like something was out of place. "Miss, I think you're in the wrong seat," the woman said, her voice sharp but polite, fake polite. The girl, no older than 15, looked up, confused. She had triple-checked her ticket before boarding. "No, this is my seat," she said softly, holding up her boarding pass. The flight attendant barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "First class is reserved for paying passengers. Economy is in the back." A few nearby passengers turned to watch. Some raised their eyebrows. A man in a suit smirked and muttered something under his breath. The girl felt a wave of heat rise to her cheeks. She tried again. "I paid for this seat," she said, keeping her voice steady. The flight attendant let out a short, impatient sigh, as if she had heard a child telling a silly lie. "I don't want to embarrass you, but you need to move before we take off." The word stung. Embarrass her? She wasn't doing anything wrong. Her hands gripped the armrests. The leather under her fingers felt cold. Another passenger, an older white woman a few rows ahead, turned around and frowned. "Is there a problem?" "No problem," the flight attendant said quickly. "Just a misunderstanding." The girl clenched her jaw. A misunderstanding? Was that what they called it? She tried again, pointing to her ticket. "It has my name. My seat is here." The flight attendant's smile faded. Her eyes scanned the girl's face, searching for something, maybe an excuse to make this go away. She didn't find one. Instead, her voice turned sharp. "Did someone give you that ticket?" she asked. The air felt heavy. The girl could feel the stairs pressing against her like invisible hands. She swallowed hard. "No, I." A man in the row behind her chuckled. "Come on, sweetheart, don't make this harder on yourself. You don't belong here." A lump formed in her throat. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was something uglier. The flight attendant placed a hand on her hip. "If you can't provide proof of purchase, you'll have to call security." Call security? Over a seat? Panic flared in her chest. She had never been in trouble before, never been accused of anything, never had a reason to defend herself like this. Passengers were watching like it was some kind of show. Some whispered. Others just stared, waiting to see what would happen next. A different flight attendant walked by, but didn't say a word. She saw what was happening and kept walking. The girl reached into her bag with shaky fingers, searching for her phone, but her hands weren't working right. The flight attendant let out another sigh. "I'll be right back," she said, already marching toward the front of the plane. The girl's heart pounded. She wasn't sure what was worse, the humiliation or the fear. Either way, something was about to happen. The flight attendant disappeared toward the front of the plane, her heels clicking against the carpeted floor. The girl's fingers tightened around the armrests as she exhaled shakily. Her mind raced. What was she supposed to do? Should she follow the attendant? Should she get up before security arrived? A woman across the aisle, a white lady in pearls and a designer blazer, leaned in slightly. "Sweetheart, if I were you, it'd just go quietly. No need to cause a scene." The girl ignored her. Her eyes flickered to the man behind her, the one who had laughed earlier. He was grinning now, amused, like this was entertainment. The murmurs grew louder. Some passengers were whispering, throwing glances in her direction. Others pulled out their phones. Were they recording? Watching? She gritted her teeth. She wasn't moving. She had every right to be here. Then she saw them. Two airport security officers entered the cabin, following the flight attendant. Their navy uniforms stood out against the soft beige interior of the first-class section. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head, scanned the rows before locking eyes on her. The flight attendant gestured toward her like she was identifying a suspect. "There she is." The officer nodded and stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Miss, I need you to come with us." Her stomach dropped. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The officer continued, his tone steady. "You've been asked to vacate the seat, and we don't want to escalate this any further. Please stand up." Escalate? The word made her pulse quicken. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't resisting. She was just sitting in her seat. Still, the eyes of the entire first-class cabin were on her. The man behind her muttered, "Knew this was gonna happen." The girl finally found her voice. "But this is my seat," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer glanced at the flight attendant. She folded her arms. "She refuses to move. She doesn't have a first-class ticket." The girl's fists clenched. That was a lie. "I have my ticket," she said, forcing the words out. "I paid for this seat." The other officer, a woman, frowned slightly. "Can I see your ticket?" She shakily handed it over. The woman examined it for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, her eyebrows knit together. She turned to the flight attendant. "This is a first-class ticket." The cabin fell silent. For a split second, the flight attendant's face paled, but she quickly recovered, shaking her head. "That can't be right. Are you sure it's not a mistake?" The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not a mistake." A beat of silence. Then, the flight attendant scoffed. "Well, it's unusual, don't you think?" The girl stiffened. "Unusual?" The white lady in pearls let out a low chuckle. "Oh, come on, be serious. There's no way she actually belongs in first class. Someone must have given her that ticket." The girl's breathing grew unsteady. She could feel her heart pounding in her ears. The officer handed the ticket back. "This ticket is legitimate." The flight attendant pursed her lips, her eyes darting toward the other passengers, as if searching for someone to back her up. When no one spoke, she turned back to the girl. "Where did you get it?" The girl's fingers trembled around the boarding pass. "I." The flight attendant cut her off. "Because I find it hard to believe a girl like you could afford first class." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The officer's face darkened. A few passengers gasped softly, while others simply waited, eyes darting between the two like this was some kind of drama unfolding before them. The girl swallowed hard. The flight attendant wasn't backing down. She wanted her out. And that's when she heard it. A deep, commanding voice from the front of the cabin. "Is there a problem here?" The girl turned her head just in time to see a man stepping forward, his expression unreadable. The moment the flight attendant's eyes landed on him, the blood drained from her face. Something shifted in the air. The cabin went silent. And in that silence, the girl realized everything was about to change. The flight attendant returned, but this time she wasn't alone. Two uniformed security officers followed closely behind her, their expressions unreadable. The moment they entered the first-class cabin, the tension thickened. The murmurs among the passengers quieted. The girl sat frozen in her seat, her fingers clenched around the armrests. Her heartbeat pounded so loudly in her ears that she almost didn't hear the flight attendant's next words. "She refuses to move," the woman said, her voice dripping with forced authority. "I need her escorted off the plane." "Escorted off the plane?" The words struck like a slap. One of the officers, a tall man with a stoic face, turned to the girl. "Miss, I need you to come with us." Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This was a scene. A show for everyone watching. The people who had smirked earlier now whispered in hushed voices. A few passengers pulled out their phones, cameras pointed at her, ready to capture whatever happened next. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "This is my seat." The flight attendant scoffed. "Enough of this nonsense. She's holding up the flight." The officer sighed and glanced at his partner before looking back at the girl. "Do you have proof of purchase?" She reached for her bag with shaking hands, desperate to grab her phone and show the receipt. But before she could unlock the screen, a deep voice echoed through the cabin. "That won't be necessary." Everything stopped. The passengers, the flight attendants, even the officers turned toward the source of the voice. A man stood in the aisle, tall and composed, his presence commanding attention without effort. His tailored black suit was pristine, his shoes polished to perfection. He walked forward slowly, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something cold and sharp. The girl let out a shaky breath. It was him. Her father. The flight attendant's face went pale. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The officer who had been speaking to the girl straightened his posture. "Sir, may I ask who you are?" The man's gaze shifted from his daughter to the security officers, then finally to the flight attendant. His voice was calm, too calm. "I'm the owner of this airline." A suffocating silence filled the cabin. The smirking businessman from earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The people who had whispered now pretended to look away. Even the flight attendants near the front of the plane seemed frozen in place. The flight attendant who had started it all blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what she had just heard. "Sir, I didn't know," she stammered, her voice cracking. "That much is obvious," he said, his tone unwavering. "But you didn't need to know. You just needed to do your job." The security officers exchanged glances, suddenly unsure of what to do. The girl's father stepped closer, looking down at the flight attendant. "You assumed she didn't belong here. You humiliated my daughter in front of an entire plane full of people. You made her feel like a criminal for sitting in the seat she rightfully paid for." The flight attendant swallowed hard. But he wasn't finished. "You disrespected her. And in doing so, you disrespected me. You disrespected my airline." The tension in the room was unbearable. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, slowly, he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her without breaking eye contact. She took it hesitantly, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. Her breath hitched the moment she saw what it was. A termination letter. Effective immediately. Her entire face drained of color. "Please," she whispered, eyes pleading. I didn't mean." But the man had already turned away. He looked at the security officers and gave them a simple nod. "Escort her off the plane." The officers didn't hesitate this time. The girl sat in her seat, watching as the same woman who had tried to throw her off the flight was now being led away. The same passengers who had laughed at her now sat in stunned silence. No one said a word. No one dared. Her father turned back to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" She took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift from her chest. Then, for the first time since boarding, she finally smiled. "I am now." The flight attendant didn't fight back. She didn't argue. She just walked, shoulders slumped, as the officers led her off the plane. The same aisle she had strutted down with confidence minutes ago now felt like a walk of shame. The passengers who had smirked, whispered, or ignored the situation sat frozen, their faces blank, their eyes darting anywhere but at the girl. She wasn't invisible anymore. As the cabin doors closed behind the disgraced flight attendant, the silence remained. No one had the courage to speak. The girl's father took his seat beside her, adjusting his cufflinks like nothing had happened. But he didn't have to say anything. The message had already been sent. Respect isn't about wealth. It isn't about power. It's about something deeper. And today, everyone on that plane had learned a lesson they wouldn't forget. A few rows ahead, the same businessman who had mocked her now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced her way, as if considering an apology, but he stayed silent. Good. The flight attendant had been punished. But the real punishment? The shame. The realization that her prejudice had cost her everything. The girl leaned back in her seat, finally at peace. First class didn't make her important. Money didn't either. She had always belonged. The only difference? Now, they knew it too. Never underestimate someone. Subscribe for more eye-opening stories.